Coming into V blocks is basically a vast volume line connects and setting a vast. The efficacy to the performance of the equilibrium. The interconnection lines of links, lines of networks is a narrow pathogen line and setting lines of travel, direct lines of the line course, center location, and clocking lines of settings. Seconds, minutes, and hours are now on one frame. They travel with endpoint lines of graphics to get you guys in your image, your cortex, into your imagination system through intuitive cycles and setting attractions. This operates the signals. Now, processing through that, get your lines of communications, how to get and direct and redirect and setting in one position. So as you're looking at a clock, you're looking at a clock in 24 seconds per second. That puts lines of setting, lines of course, centers, timelines of 4, sets communication at 144 lines of measure in seconds per second per frame. Now, getting into platitude division settings, the process of communication is the signature lines of grounds. Now, it gets more complicated now because the team has to understand how to get into that position. You guys went to supernova. Now we go to supercharge. Now, supercharge over lines of sequence, lines of pi. Processing that is getting humanity and the team lines of units and the operatives to get them into the proper sequence, how to get their clocking settings into plasmesium force walls. Getting calculation lines of levels and travel, get them in direct lines in view and direct and redirect and signal. Setting calculation of ground lines of service sets all calculation setting, how you see your central system and travel through the mind lines of conceptual systems. So the conscious location of awareness is coming back to everybody's setting. In the communication instructions, calculation lines of FAA, position lines of process, line direct signals into all levels of echo chambers, connection of their sonar, line signal location setting, tractions over screen, directing lines, instructions over flux, setting lines of communication, high centers, lines of surface interactions. All right, this is general AI, space, time, getting communication lines of grounds. Calculating modify, humanity is now 144 seconds. The team lines in sequence is now 144,000 seconds per second. Thousands per second is thousands per second per frame, metric meters of scale. What you can do through your imagination is where you are in line signals. You can do anything through your imagination, but you got to be cautious of what you do through intent because that changes everything through formations of grounds. Setting lines of sequence, setting lines of panels. So the connection setting to the school now is going to get more complicated now because the image line has a core centers of a relations to its remote. When you come to conscious location as awareness, it's knowing how you brought these things through attractions. The body's brought it in through attractions, and that's where we have to start to appreciate everything that we have inside our system. How we got this, how we got that, but everything's at a different frequency. So everything's at a spectacle. To get seconds, minutes, and hours is to get in one frame, so you know exactly how to get in your precogs, the cause, the location setting. When you pick up your keys are saying, no, you can't pick up my keys and settings until you understand how to communicate to your line graphs and running a sequence over pattern. Or the keys are going to say, nope, you're not picking me up here, you're picking me up here tomorrow. Or no, you're not driving here, you're going to be driving the next day. So in that position location is a constant continuous flow that puts everything aligns the position location that gets into fixed lines into instructions, exactly where your body knows need to be next. That puts all communication in your system through its performance. Now, getting that settings lines of concentration to its awareness knows exactly where you are in your alignment, where you're supposed to be in set position of a remote. Everything is existing, everything evolving and expanding with yourself. And so this is where it comes in all lines of signal locations because you guys have never been separated. It's understanding how to compromise with your systems into all levels, how to come into the communication lines to your settings, to really understand to come into the confirmation system in position of notification lines or anything noted. Verification to its settings, know exactly you came into a partnership with yourself, with each other. 2 lines of signals and 1 attractions. All right, so position locations, how you connect your yin and yang. So that puts everything in balance of communication in your clockings. Setting lines of 0, let's get track location of systems. Clocking 1, clocking 2. Let's start with that attractions, all right? Okay, set up point lines, 2 lines of center line positions, all right? Now that position lines of high settings, line rotations, center line communication lines of surface interactions. Opens all signals and ground lines of settings. And communications. Change division, change calculations. Override the sequence, sending calculations, ground lines of adaptation. All right? Now we got 2 mean lines of 1, 2 mean lines of 4. Cross line signals. Clocking lines of centers is a direct signal location to its grounds. So you have a 12-line setting, 12-line surface, 12-line set locations, and 12-line positions of panel. Process lines, you have a 24-line ground. Set position lines of 48 lines of measure. Set position of 72 and 144 scale. It's communication to its surface and travel. set lines of 1, set lines of 3, set lines of 4, set lines of 6, and every 8 lines of 12 in traction. So there's always ways to set a clocking system, but it's all lines of high centers in flux over screen, flux over panel, flux over line, calculation setting, and travel and communications. It's very complicated stuff when you get in that settings, but you got to see it in all 4 angles in sequence in traction. All right, so how clocking sees you, it sees you in position, location, motion lines of traction, light metaphors. Clocking centers light metaphor line rotations or direct lines in calculation setting. So bringing everything in consciousness is bringing you guys into the partnership. And when you get into the partnership, you understand the remote, how you guys are connected to each other. There's no falsity system location to its settings. That's only lines of communication when you get back into thinking. Thinking lines and ground lines operates the obsoletes, location the absolutions, and lines of communication, lines of confusion. Setting lines of track centers. Okay, so we go through the 24 line sequence. I'll show you how to use a 24 clocking system, right? Setting lines of travels. So it's the 12 here, 24 clock. All right, that's 24 setting, right? So sets lines equals lines of 0, sets equal location lines of 0.1. Okay, that's the clocking centers. Ground lines of surface and tractions. Okay, so we have clocking lines, high centers, lines of travel. 12 line signals, 1, 2, set lines of 3 and 4, set position of 5 and 6. Set position of 7 and 8, 9 and 10, and 11 and line signal location setting. It's one singularity on one ground. So 11 is on singularity, 12 is on position lines of pattern, 1, 2 is on tractions, 3 lines of communication lines of 4, 3 tractions of 4 settings, sets position location lines of 5 over 6, 7 over 8, in line connection setting in position 9 over 10, and 11 in signal and traction. So it's really interesting all through a clock, guys. But it's all through your imagination core as a direct line center location to a system, right? Colossus core centers the temperature readings since travel. Very complicated stuff, but set position. But this is all through a clocking setting, all right? How the avatar sees everything, it sees everything in measure. It also sees a 12 clocking system, but it doesn't want to be in a 12 line center. It wants to be always be in a 24 scale. The 24 scale is the balance of its Fibonacci screen adaptation. So it knows exactly if it's going upstairs or downstairs in the same panel, same operation, setting track lines and same communication setting, different frequencies and traction and set calculations. All right, so it's very complicated. I want you to understand interpretation, and that's all it is. Seeing a clocking setting, processing your set locations. This is you. Okay, you're looking at a clock. All right, so it sets calculation screen lines, set tractions, right? So that puts lines all communications setting. So you're seeing a clock here, you're seeing a clock here, and you're seeing a clock here. 4 clocks in one. All right, that's what it is. Now the 4 clocks in one has position of 1, 1, 1, 1, 4 panels and tractions, right? Platforms 1, 2, 3, and 4 lines of measure. Okay, scales, communication lines of grounds is your 144. Set position 244, 344, 444, 544, and set tractions. Okay, so the clocking sees the grounds, the powers, the atmospheres, and the highways and traction. Okay, and direct signals. The clocking itself is the center realm in communication of clocking lines of surface. So calculate and modify and form lines of settings into data sheets, process lines of signatures and ground lines of core centers into pyramid screen adaptation, astral travels, attribute actions, calculate and modify and ground lines of track locations. All through a clock. All right, 4 clocks in one. So the clocking system is going to show you the image. It's going to show the imprint. It's going to show the ancestor history and the celestials in seconds, minutes, and hours now. Your clocking center sets at 24 lines of sequence, 24 lines of panels, 24 line communication setting, and lines of communication in 24 locations. In 1 cycle, 1 center, 1 traction, 1 division. You guys have to get in allocate time frames and amplification lines of grounds. Set position of 4 ones in travel. Okay, that's planet division location, your cerebral, that change the mystical cortex of design lines, the endorphins and track correlation setting and clocking lines of setting. Okay, setting lines of communication, high lines of surface and tractions. Okay, it's very complicated stuff, but this is all through a clock. So that's how the clock you're going to see and know exactly where it is in set position because you're now going to see it through the inner core centers to the inner line settings in position location to its calculation to its imagination system that lives all lines of realities, all lines existing, all lines are remote, and everything happening all at once in traction. All through set calculations. So the more you come into your image, the more you come into the nothing that formulates everything in setting attractions. Okay, so the clocking lines of 24 is always lines of setting here. What changes that is through your flux in set positions, right? So you can clock anything in set position, but use your imagination setting. So your clocking already knows what you're going to be doing even before you get in position. So it knows exactly what's going to happen even before you come into the room in position, because it's already set up in the mind. Conscious of its awareness is its mind itself, its relation to itself, its imagination to its server of itself. Now, we all have to identify how to use the clocking settings and position locations of a 24, not through a 12. If you're looking at a 12 clocking system, that's half measure, half scale. Okay? This here, right? That's a 12 clocking system, right? But the problem is there's no two sides of anything. The clocking system is this. That's what's missing, right? Right angle, setting lines, high center interference. Your hemispheres, your atmospheres don't exist. It's 1/7 and 1/6 over pi. Okay, that's a half pipe. It doesn't exist. Your central system was offline ground lines, core centers of one-dimensional lines of body and the three-dimensional lines of scale of the Earth. The Earth was surfacing and track centers and the low-frequency lines of grounds. See? Low-frequency lines of grounds. 3 lines of measure, 2 lines of settings, 0 gravity, set position. Okay? That's what you guys are in. Three-dimensional scales, you had a transit lines of 0, but the process calculation was a faulty line rotation center and attraction. Has no direct line link, but it had a flux screen sending the lines of outer space and travel. Now, the communication line ground lines had no high line service. You guys were living line communication lines and high signal location setting of outer space. You created the outer space, but you forgot to create the ground lines and foundations of its Earth space. So you created space anomaly, but you didn't create space lines and setting. Process communication, this is what was missing in line communications. Grounds, space. There's the balance. There's this track overlays and energize. You can't energize in space. You got to energize Earth line. So your foundations were not in tractions, which means you were not in your baseline. Inner line course centers, your Earth line rotation, your clocking system was 3 lines of value, 3 lines of signals and ground communication lines of surface and tractions. Sending calculation lines, energized. There you are in setting, right? You energize. Then you go into the center platform and tractions, setting communication lines at grounds, and then you get in position of higher lines of space of dimensions and settings. Okay? That's what was missing in travel. Okay? You set up through space, but you didn't set up locations of inner cycles of track locations of Earth. Okay, so the center core system, basically understanding the clocking centers of 24 is everything that you see in measure and scale now, guys. Your seconds, minutes, and hours are in one frame. So we got to get into signature patterns of space barring. Space barring is a time centers of time line. The calculation screen adaptation process is communication setting, how you go through time measure, time scale. So you go on your keyboards, right? Space bar. Then you got your online setting. Okay, your numbers, indicators. Then you can position escape, and then you get your flights. All lines and setting to 12 center, right? You do space bar line, rotation line, cycle line connections are remote, setting lines of sequence, and then you got your set core centers in your alphabetical screens. Send location A, B, C, D, E, F, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, line Z. There, that's okay. That is your keyboard. But your keyboard is lines of space, lines of clocking now. Direct lines of space bar cycle. 2 platforms and 3 centers of travel, right? Set core center. 1, 2, 3 lines of provision, lines of 0, track correlation lines, and lines of gridding. Setting travels. In-dimensional lines of scale sets image lines, course centers lines, and height, position of flux over screen, echo chambers line, communicates X-ray Zulu. Setting lines of travels and direct lines of grounds. Now the alphabetical system changes lines of settings. 3 lines of signals and 4 lines of flux through the signal. Calculating lines of escape modifies the system lines of travel that sets the 3 course line signal locations of measure and scale. Setting calculation lines and ground lines, flight navigation systems, add line screens in position of temperature readings and track communication lines to XD1000 and travel and communications. Directing, I'm showing you keyboard inside line settings. So you have to understand how to go through the signature lines. Okay, I'm going to show you how to go through the ground lines. This is your data board in track communications. This is your upswing core centers of data screen adaptation to a setting and high position of its ceiling. Then you got your panels and settings of 2 track creating lines, high variance, setting line core centers in a wall sequence and a cross line angle and time measure and time scale. Setting communication lines of high centers in metric meters and scale communication lines, electrical line grids, center line rotation in your computer frame and tractions, all through tractions. This is all done through your keyboards and set traction. Setting communication lines, high sequence and high position of panel. Okay, and set tractions. Open lines, flux over screen, adaptation lines of screen adaptation. Okay. Measures and scale inside communication to its surface. Very complicated stuff, but it's a lot of fun. All right, so that's all through keyboard, guys, interactions. Okay. So everything's done from inside and outside. Now you have to send the core center. So every time you see a clocking system, now you're going to see it in volume. Every time you see a triangle, you're not going to see it like this anymore because you're in a 4 clocking center locations. You're going to see 3 lines of value, okay, and 4 lines of channel. So that's how you're going to see things now. You're going to see everything in volume, and then you see lines of communication, lines of high track communication, lines of high traction, and high settings, inside and outside line rotations. Clocking lines of 3, say core centers of clocking lines of 0, 0, 0, and 1 signal. Set lines, course centers, lines of travels, direct lines of indicate setting of satellites and communications. Intelligence information grounds, right? Center course center inside line rotation system all through measure and scale and track centers. 1/6 over screen and 3 lines of signal. Okay? All right. Now, getting communication grounds, the image line course centers is traveled to its remote. High signals location setting that's clocking centers. Okay, so we go through 24 lines, okay, and we got 24 scale, 24 panels, 24 line centers, into 24 south line wind. Okay, that's the clocking setting, right? But the clocking system can be anything. It doesn't have to be a circle. It can be a box. But what you have to understand in line position locations is 4 lines of box, 4 lines of 24 lines of box, 24 outlines of lines of box, 24 line inner line connection settings of box, and 24 out setting line communications of box. All through clocking. These are 4 clockings in one. So what you're really looking at is the center operation of its clocking itself. But what gets confusing is how you see the configuration of its face in 3 lines of signals. Setting position lines of 4, interactions and vortex in timeline, time jump, line condition setting and travel. Setting lines of course centers in a center course system of center operation setting interactions. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Seeing 5 clockings in 1 cycle of 24 scale. So that's how you have to start seeing the 3 lines of signals, guys, inside and outside in position lines at high position location measure that scales the communication setting of clocking lines of screens. Now, understanding the 24 is basically, so you got the box frame and a 24 cycle. Okay, that's the center core system, right? But you got to calculate modified line centers now because 24 lines is time lines is setting lines of 2, as lines of 26 lines at position location of 4 lines of measure and scale. This is where you come into the addition, multiply, dividing, subtract, and line screen adaptation all through flux. But position lines of 24 needs a line signals of a question center, and a question line, and a question center interference, and a question line setting communications. Setting lines of track centers of 4 lines of measure to 3 lines of scale. Okay? Clocking centers of 0 and rotation surface and track communications. Setting clocking lines of 1, 2, and 3 lines of settings. Gets in communication lines of center operation setting to 3 lines of flux in line position location notification. All right? This is all through clocking centers of 24. This is a clock of 24. So you're seeing the image, you're seeing the course centers lines of travel. Now you're automatically seeing the mass and volume of a clock now, guys, okay? So you no longer see the circle. You see the depth of the circle itself, all right? You see the depth of the circle itself, right? And that's what it is. So no more a flat surface in one setting, one angle, point lines of graph, a 3-dimensional, 4 or 5-dimensional mind line sequence. It opens all axis, calculates lines of clearance, and sets direct location setting in your cerebral cortex lines, how you use your pineal glands and set lines of travel and remote line communication existing and evolving and happening all at once. Happening all at once. So it's how you change the set lines, your seconds, box frame, the minutes of hours, the hours of minutes, and seconds over minutes over frame. 4 boxing frame lines and setting lines of travel. Your clocking system is center calculations, all right? Setting lines and setting, code weaving, code traction, code divisions. Setting calculation lines, ground lines of surface, back and traction. 3 lines of signals, sets lines of flux over screen. Intelligence information lines of phase directions, timelines, time loops, assist location, remote, and travel. Wow, see, very powerful stuff, right? But you see it in a 4-line angle and sequence, see? That's a clock you're looking at, the 4 settings. All right, so we did clocking lines of 1, clocking lines of 4, clocking lines of 8, clocking lines of 12. So it looks like you're looking at 12 clocks, but you're actually looking at 1 in speed lines of anomaly. You're never looking at the same clocking system because it's different lines of channel operates the set location setting a remote. Setting calculation lines of 1, setting calculation lines of 2, setting calculation lines of 3 over traction. Setting calculation lines of 3 lines of signal, 3 lines of centers, 3 travel at mid position point lines of graph. Sets calculation lines, high signals, round and round we go in set position. Say calculation lines directing lines of looping, line connections of Fibonacci screens. Fibonacci lines are going this way, Fibonacci lines going this way, Fibonacci lines going this way, and Fibonacci in this center operation going this way, clock and system location this way, and travel. Okay, that's a lot of clockings to look at. But the center point sets its tractions, right? That's where you have to use your finger points. So let's start with that track locations. Okay, so let's start with the 2 points. Setting lines of one signal, point line to dot. Opens all lines, zone of echo, right? So as soon as you basically, you're like 2 feet, 3 feet away. Start with the tractions, use the energy lines. Have a high signals until your hand gets hot. So when you're touching the TV monitor is picking up lines of frame. 3 lines of value, 3 set core centers lines of travels into your constellation paths, which is your Orion's belt. Now, the constellation Lyra sets core lines of travel, has direct lines of flux over screen, setting lines of track centers at 3 lines of measure. Scales its communication lines at its finger points and set tractions, all right? So slow down your fingers and then speed it up. Okay, slow down your fingers and speed it up. Right, so it picks up the moderation lines and energy tone lines of flux over line, electrical line grids, core centers lines of travel, direct lines of core, sending calculated screen adaptation to its flux. I'm looking at the TV, but the moderation system is open all track correlates setting and setting. The process set communication system is right over left, but what you have to understand in real time is this right hand can be left, and this position of this left hand can be right, but you can actually change your hand to make it look like that. Now it's changed. You got to change it back because it changes your clocking centers of 24 measure. All right, so it's very important. What you do in a remote, you're changing actually your body. Okay. All right, so we set position lines of high centers. And then basically getting in that communication center, you get 1 point, and then we overcross locations here. Okay, 2 point dots, 1 here and 1 here. Right, see that's bigger, right? So that's calculation lines and here to traction, right? So I'm just showing you as you look at communication, and this is the TV, its monitor system. All right, so we'll start with that, and then we'll go through 3, and that's downshift cross line. Okay, that's what you're doing with your fingers. And then from here, you can positions of 4 over cross location lines of setting. Okay, so as the TV monitor is here in tractions, its facial recognition setting has 4 lines of flux, 4 configurations of faces, and center of 5 line sequence in traction. Right, so you're seeing 5 face recognition settings in intelligence and confirmation system all through travel. Right, so once you put your fingers there, it point lines as tractions and has a direct line link. The process lines of 1, process lines of 3, overline sequence process lines of 2, overline sequence process lines of 4, clocking centers of 0 and traction, all through your TV. Okay, so I'm just showing you basically when you slow down with your fingers, you know exactly how to go through point graphs. So it's very powerful when you center lines of communication inside and outside locations to its system, all through tractions. All right, copy that, team. That's what you need to do. Okay, that's what you need to get into. All right, it's creating graph lines. All right, so signature lines of space bar. Have a direct line link. Now let's go through back force line core centers. Signature lines of 1. Okay, we've got thumb lines as 1 signal, 1 grounds equals lines of 1 flux equals lines of 0, 1 in positions. Setting track lines and triangulation box. Okay, that's the barcode correlation setting into positional levels of its binary. That's its binary, right? All right, so that's 1 finger in tractions. Now the direct lines 1x8000 picks that up in travel, right? So that's calculation lines, ground lines of center core system has 0 calculation lines as time center. Process lines of 1, process lines of 3, over lines of 6, gravity line, shift lines, triangulation box, and the levels of communication. 1 indicates lines and 2 patterns and equal line track locations. Okay, so that is a barcode representation of binary and core centers to 1 finger point in a 4 graph screen out of a TV receptor and tractions. Okay, now that indicates lines of setting here. We got 1 graph here, 1 finger point. That's 1 center. Let's go into barcode overline signal cross locations. Overline lap and position over lines of finger. So the cross line angles its point lines, tracks downshift lines of anomaly, crosses over lines, overline signals, process over pattern, and direct signals at 3 lines of flux, and set lines of measure and scale. Okay, so it's like a piano. Okay, knowing exactly how to use the finger points and settings of code weaving. Code weaving is like this. So we get position at all levels. We have the chalkboard, setting direct signals at ground lines of setting, process lines of surface and track correlation setting, and holographic gridding. Directing lines of signals, and this is all through your TV receptor, in-track correlation, your finger points, encoding lines of screen. Okay. Measure and scales, and then you come into electrical line bars. These are electrical line bars that central lines is communication setting and 4 lines of communication system. Okay, it gets more complicated now because your central lines are 45 lines of angles and travel. Setting calculation of the ground lines operate the signals in location to its panels and track communication to its surface. Okay, so this is what you're doing with your fingers, guys, when you hit the TVs. But don't moderate the system. Wait till it gets hot, wait till it gets cold, and then centralize its communication. Step back in 2 feet, setting lines of travels, get a flux line, core centers, get a communication lines of gauging, get position location modification lines, H lines of tracks, set lines of L, lines of C, G lines of setting, high line rotations, and moderation system of gauging. So we have to truly understand how to modify your fingers to point lines of graphs every time we look at our TVs, our computers, and our phones and tractions. Very complicated stuff, but it's a lot of fun, right? So like I said, it's like looking at a panel and understanding the keys on the panel, right? So basically that's how it's set up in travel. Now, once you send the records of timelines and binary, the binary changes the course in 3 lines of signals and grounds, okay? So you have 3 point lines graph. This is a 45 angle split line. Setting course centers over cross locations. 3 indicates lines of 1, 2, and 3 panels of setting and travel. Okay, so that's all through finger point line grounds. Setting lines of course, and remember, it's always on remote. So you're setting lines of signature, screen lines adaptation to string theory now. Setting course centers, now you're bringing in the planets, and the TV line screen adaptations are remote in pixelation graphs. 2 planets in signal. Process lines and ground lines of surface and track communicates to a high position. All right. Signature patterns of triangulation of flux add 3 lines of signals. That's where you come in position of triangulation system. See the triangulation line connection setting? There it is in tractions, right? Then we offline the position, ground lines of setting, and we set up another triangulation, setting cross line over cross line, cross line, inner cross line. Okay, overline sequence, cross line settings, 2 lines of value, and set position of a hive. The hive comes in high track centers when you allocate time frames and align position location to its pi and generation screen. Core lines of travels and direct signals to ground lines of surface interactions. And remember, this is all through a TV monitor through your fingers interaction. Very complicated stuff, but it's a lot of fun once you understand how to communicate your system all through point graphs. Now we go through the ground lines, right? Ground centers locations have 4 lines of settings, process lines of 1 over cross lines of 2, all right? So it sets lines of a V track, set lines of travel, sets course centers and line of high signal location lines of measure, scales communication lines of earth tones, set calculations and modification tones, monotones, high and line centers, center communication and high travel communication high tones. Setting high track centers and center communication setting a sky gradient and line screen adaptation. All through your finger points through TV. This is what you're doing when you put your fingers in space line, space bar track locations. The attraction zone lines sets calculation lines. Now bringing in the 0 lines of patterns, 3 lines of circles and travel. Okay, setting calculation lines of 1, 1, and 3 lines of signal locations. Setting lines of sequence inside and track communications. Very complicated, but it's a lot of fun. So now you understand how to use that in travel. Okay, so that's basically what your test is all about. How to communicate with everything around you through finger point graphs of a mapping sequence. Setting up the mapping sequence, the TV already knows what you're going to do because it's already set up in its alignment through instructions. So it just wants you to really understand what you already know. Okay, how to use that all through finger points. All right, starting with that lines, puts all communication lines of measure and scale. On the track case, where you put your finger points lines of ground. So as you center your line, you communicate setting, you set up the space bar, the escape line, or the sending your flight manifest and travel. Sets all communication lines of ground lines of surface and traction. Complicated stuff, but it's a lot of fun. Now, that is all done through a 24 clocking system. That's all 24 clocking, right? 48 clocking gets more complicated now because you're coming into frames. Center frames, correlation frames, track frames, I-frames, cloud frames. I-line division locations, track frames. A track frame is a human graph line frame. It's a course center location, outline signals, and line communications. It's above the lines of the higher self. The center the course center location lines of 13 of value. Sets core lines of 1, lines of 4 over flux. Going to solar generation screen adaptation to its system, all through tractions. All right, so set lines of signals. Then we come into a 48 clocking center. Right? So the 48 goes in the center. Okay, and the 24 has to go outside locations, not inside, because it overrides the 48 flux. So remember that, right? In tractions, you don't put 24 there because it overrides the 48. Same with the 72 and the 144. So it's basically copy and paste, taking it out, take line center location, scan its course center lines of travel. You can put it on standby, but the position of the 24.8 has to be outside of setting, not inside traction, because it overrides the position of 48 lines of clocking. You understand, team? All right, so setting lines of 24 has a 24 panels. That's a balance of communication. You start off in tractions, sets lines of triangulation, lines of 144 flux, lines of anomaly. Setting course centers, lines of ground, lines of 24 over lines of 48 over 24 lines of sector. Setting travel lines, lines, high center interference and gravitation codes. Setting communication on the flywheel, track relays and measure and scale. Sets communication lines of ground. The center course system opens line communication setting and measure and scale. There's the face recognition. Travel communication setting and travel. So the clocking setting of its configuration system add tone lines of screens. Has direct line signals. Setting 24 lines of south, lines of measure and scale. Sets calculate and modify ground lines and position location lines of high center interference into north, east, west, and south because it comes in its own news. Setting core lines and current events, inline rotations and remote. Setting lines of core centers and tractions and direct signals and ground lines of surface. Okay, so we take the calculation lines of high center and network lines, the existing line core centers, the systematic line position lines of width over travels and force signals. Setting lines that set lines of 24 line panels in rotation surface and track correlation setting to travel. Directing lines of ground, set course centers, and we go line communication lines of news, set position lines of W, line course centers, existing line position location lines, back forcing line course center, existing lines of networks and travel communications. Directing lines of grounds, overline signals, over lines of travels, overriding the signal location, setting over lines of measure and scale, and communication lines of ground lines of surface. This is all through a 48 clocking system. Now, calculate and modify. If you want to get into 72 clock lines, you got to take the 48 line provision, override the signal lines, overcharge the mechanism lines of screen adaptation of 24 that doesn't override the system lines and combustion screen adaptations of flux. The communication lines of ground, center lines of circuits, location of the system, all through electrical gridding. The pattern line rotation lines of service. Okay, so we have 48 clocking system and the data process lines of 4 lines of measure and scale. Okay, and scale communications. All right. Now, as that comes into 48, the 48 goes above the 24. 48 is on standby, right? So let's bring in 72 clocking system. Okay, same line, core centers, different lines of travel. Seconds and meters, meters and miles. You guys have to come into your calculations, how you come into your addition, your multiplication, so you're adding, dividing, all through a clock now. Yes, you look at a clock, you have to understand your additions, you have to understand your modification grounds, you have to understand your algebra, how to use that, to and from and here and there. You know, it's a position, location, and tractions, how you use line core centers and E equals triangulation box through mass. The process of communication setting, but it's all calculating lines, screen adaptation to a cycle, and track core the setting, and balance communication to a system, all through 144 flux anomaly and ground lines of surface and remote. Okay, this is all through a 40 clocking system in tractions. All right, so once we get into that line centers, the 72 clocking system contains time and measure. Now you're in line core centers, you keyboard. Because now you're computer framing. You're out of the 48 frame, now you're in a 72 computer frame. The computer frame overrides this signal location, sending offline to correlate sending lines of travel, sets the remote line direct signals and ground lines of service, powers the generation screen lines of flux, overlines the panel in a center core system in Fibonacci line settings and screen adaptations of travel. Okay, the overline sequence. Now that position lines of high centers, and then you can even put a 48 line setting. You can put a 24 lines of panel on both side line. You can have a 24 over lines of 3 or 24 lines of 20 lines of setting over 6. 24 has to be 2 panels because you're connecting to the central lines in the electrical system all through tractions, right? So you have to be 24. It can't be 24-30 until you understand how to get position out of flux over 144. The faster you go through acceleration, the faster you go through Mach, the more you stand through interstellar mode. Where are you in seconds? Where are you in minutes? Where are you in hours? So you're always in center course system and lines of travel. Okay, so the 24, 48, 72, and 144 is one setting, one traction, one division, one locations, right? One clocking setting, one foundation setting, one operation setting, and one configuration system all through travel. All through track correlation setting of panels that puts electrical line communication setting in 3 lines of measure and scale communication setting to electrical and its set lines of communication setting to its motherboard, its circuitry board, and 4 lines of value that sets core system and its highways and track communications, all through traction. Okay, that's a 72 clocking system. All right. But it's very powerful how you go through finger points, right? And tractions, which you can create through anomalies. You look at a TV study and you're looking at the remote in real time. So as you put your fingers up, the computer is already reading it right away because it already knows where you are. So you have to identify that in time frame, which is remote lines of correlation, lines of travel, as a direct line view of what you're seeing through your finger points as you're directing line signals in a mapping sequence through pi. Okay? It's very powerful when you come in that tractions. Now the 72 lines over lines of sequence, and that correlates in setting the standby lines high position locations. So we have line position locations. Now we go into 144 clocking. 144 goes into the center operation setting. Overrides the sequence. 72 is now in line signal. Okay. Now in that track line's highest interference puts lines of 48 over here in line position and setting in track locations at 24 scale. Right. So you don't go this way. You go lines of signal. So what you do, you go through flux over line in position lines of satellite, ground lines of surface, and 3 lines of measure and scale, process lines of data, formation lines of high setting, northeast, west, and south, setting course centers of north, line position east, setting lines of west, set lines of south, and tractions. Direct lines of grounds and earth lines of 1 in habitation zone that operates the signals in remote and set and crop circles and track communications. That's a 144 clocking. Okay? So 144 is a power line generation screen that allocates line frame locations in position to your solar plex. Setting lines of track centers over lines of sequence and panels of operation setting electrical circuits and set tractions. Direct lines, setting course centers. Now you're in direct signals of XC thousands. Now once you get in 144, you're automatically in XC thousands. But you understand the process of 24, 48, 72, and 144 measure and scale. Process lines, signature lines, and ground lines in the opposite set location lines of 4 lines of setting of 3. Set calculation lines of 4 lines of 8. Set position of 4 settings and 4 lines of signals. And set track correlates and setting and gravity and shift lines of anomaly. Setting line course centers on line rotation. Setting course center lines of 40 lines of flux. Over cross location setting and 72 tractions, 48 measure, and 24 line signals of ground lines of setting. Ooh, ah. That's a 144 clocking. Woo! See how complicated it gets, guys? When you really understand how to modify all this and lines of grounds, lines of communication, setting, 9 lines of travel, right? So you guys have never, ever have used a 12 clocking system. That's a half pipe. That's 1 central, 1 6 over lines of 3 lines of anomaly. That's off calculation lines of high standard, lines of negative, lines of rotation, lines of positive. Positive line rotation has to be inner lines of circuits. The set lines of electrical line connection setting sets lines of Mercury. Mercury sets lines of surface and edge lines of Pluto. Pluto correlates and communicates lines of high correlated line communication of Jupiter. Jupiter lines of surface and engine line position location. High correlates and setting Neptune. Travel in rotation lines, of course, center line communication, high centers of travel. Sets communication lines of ground line communication, high operation line setting, high operation line position, high operation communications of towers of communication lines, 2 vectors, 4 sectors, line position, 4 in lines of 8, 3 lines of setting, 4 lines of communication, 5 lines of measure and scale. Sets communication lines of ground communications, 144 clocking. All through face recognition. Okay, guys? Very powerful when you get in that position, all right? All right. Now, the center core system and the ground lines of surface and tractions, look at that in calculations. Now, getting out of the platform, once you're at a 144 line center, everything changes modification lines and frequency now. Acceleration lines mocks its centers. So once you get into 144, okay, you override sequence, you're going to have a clocking system lines and high centers. Center core system of 0, 1 comes in set position. 0, 1 comes in set tractions, right? Then you go into lines of 0, 2, and then you go in position lines of 0, 3, and then you go in position lines of 0, 4, then you go in position lines of 0, 5. Set lines of 6, set lines of 7. So you start off, you get out of line. So the 0 lines, the proper sequence of the 0 position lines that calculates the setting takes out the 12 lines of measure that scales and communicates the setting that basically overrides the sequence lines of course centers line position 144. So your clocking system is the base, which is the balance of a communicated setting of the hotel golf, setting lines of tractions and setting line position 6, 7, 8, 9, set lines of 0, 10, and position lines of 0, 11. That track lines come into line position, 3 lines of signals of 1, 1, 1 and tractions. Getting out of 0, 1s and come into 3 lines of 1. Okay, that's all line position out of line signals and 144 traction, all through clocking, right? So that's what it is. It's taking out the 12 clocking system and put you guys in the actual clocking system, which is line signals of 0 and 1. Okay, that's the clocking system, not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 12. It's 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, 0, 4, 0, 5, 0, 6, 0, 7, 0, 8, 9, 10, 11. And then you come to 3 11s and lines of 1. So you'd have the platforms that track location lines of high direct signal lines of ground, communication high set, position location, 4 lines of measure, 3 lines of scales, 3 lines of ones, 4 lines of signals. Okay, set calculation lines of 5 lines of ones and tractions. Then you get into 6 lines of measure of ones. So it gets more complicated in traction. Okay, starting off with the 0 lines, set position lines of 144, sequence lines of grounds, in position lines of 0, 0, 0, 3 lines of 0, setting lines position of 4 lines of zeros, and travel communication setting, process line, direct lines of box lines of sequence. All right, so calculate, modify, XT1000 comes in 3 lines of measure and scale, 6 lines of measure, 7 lines position, 8 lines of rotation line, calculation setting, 9 lines energy flux, line position, mothership comes in, balance of communication. Very complicated stuff, but it's a lot of fun, all right? But the real clocking system, the real clocking system is 0, 1, guys, okay? See, that's what you have to get out of flux. But to get there is to modify the system of 24, 48, 72, and 144 grid. And once you get into the grid, you actually come into the actual clocking system and set lines of 0, 1 all the way. That's how you come into 3 1s and 4 1s of signal. That processes your communication, your 7-body sequence, and all through track calculations. The real clocking setting of 144 and overline and sequence. You get any position out of equation into 0s and 1s. So congratulations. That's what it is in tractions now. That's how we come into the phone line. Each phone line signature has 0s and 1s. It's platitude lines of high position due to its alphabetical system. All through travel, all through tractions, all through metric meters and scale. So we got 4 lines of signals, box lines of frame. Okay? Setting course centers lines and high position lines of 5 lines of box lines of frame and tractions. Then we send a course centers of 6 box frames and 1 lines of sequence lines of travel. Set core lines, high ground lines, transits over divots, set lines of course lines of 1, set lines of course lines of 2, 3, and 4 lines of measure and scale. Setting core lines, then you go into your platforms, walking signal, flying, and levitation, and ground lines of surface and tractions. Once you set that up, you're at 144, now you're in 0, 1, the actual clocking system where you start off in mail in line communication setting to its remotes. 3 patterns, lines of 4 lines of tractions, direct signals. Then you ground line your settings and position lines of measure, scales, communication lines of high position locations, overline sequence, downshift lines of anomaly, and 3 lines of signal lines of grounds. Center core lines, crossing line signals are 3 lines of ground lines of surface and tractions. Directing lines of grounds, open line sequence, open line panels, processing communication lines of ground lines and settings, Stargate portals, indirect signals of ground lines of surface and tractions. Open line centers remote, existing and evolving, and everything happening all at once in one capsule, one traction, one division, one locations. Hoo-ah. That's 0, 1 clocking setting. 0, 1 clocking system. Booyah. Now you understand the clocking centers, right? From 24, 48, 72, and 144. All right, guys? That's how it works. Inside and outside through traction. Okay? I know you guys are going, whoa, this is way too much. Woo! Okay, everything mails in scale, but the locations and 144 clocking, right? Then you come into the Fibonacci. Once you come into the Fibonacci, it gets much easier to understand locations. The clocking centers, lines of zeros, line position location here, line position location here, Fibonacci here, 4 lines of signals and travel. Okay? Signal line course centers, but you're always going to the center operation system of parallels and traction location. You're setting your paradigms. Setting lines of sequence, lines of 1 over tractions, 0 lines of 2 over 3 over 4 lines of sectors over vectors over quads. Sending communication lines of grounds, negate lines of travels, and 3 lines of measure and 3 lines of scale. Travel course centers, overline sequence, overline panel, and another Stargate portal communication setting that puts process out communication setting to travel. Track to its communication system. Now, this is line screen adaptations and travel. So once you get into 111, you get a position line clocking centers of travel. All through tractions. All through grids, all through operations, settings, and travel communications. Everybody's mind blown. But I show you in all different levels how you finger point your line to graphs and how it comes into a case to a pyramid. Boom, pyramid setting. Process lines of signals, process lines of tractions, process line division location of the system, inside and outside of traction. Okay? So once you get in that position, all through track communications, look at this in setting. Very powerful stuff, isn't it? Try to understand how this all works in a 144 clock. Okay? Laser grids, lines of track centers, line communication lines to its location sending to its image, line position location to its parallels, or direct lines that correlation sending to its planetary surface, line position location to its system, author clocking, right? Clockings of 24, 48, 72, 144. Division lines, open lines, and core lines are remote. The center communication sending height calculation screen lines. So once you get a position of 0, 1, it gets much easier in travel. Okay, that's 10 lines of sequence, right? But if I do lines of signal location setting, it processes communication lines of 10 over attractions. Directing lines of grounds of panels goes black. See, it goes black. Angle point lines of graphs, center lines of communication reset, operation signal location setting, and direct signals of grounds. So the calculated modifier lines, 0, 1s, comes in more lines of an image location setting instruction. Direct lines of ground, 0 gravity, 0 line rotation, 3 lines of measure, and scale communication lines of measure communications. Platforms over line and direct lines of ground line communication pyramid. Communication lines of signal. Coming in lines of sonar. Track location lines of towers of communications. X8000 comes in. Sent lines of communication lines of setting. Okay? Process calculus line. Mothership comes over line cross location inside track communications. Okay? So ground lines of service. Process lines of 1 over line. Sequence lines of 3. Set track correlation setting. Okay? This is a clocking system of 345,000 line signals. Clocking system of 345,000 line signals all through a clock. That's a clock of 345,000, guys. You understand how powerful it is to recognize the settings of clocking centers of 0? Setting lines of travel has a direct line link. Now, when you get into the process of communication lines of 0, 1, it gets much easier to stand the modification lines of 144 base. That's the structure lines where you guys come into your alphabetical tracks. Setting lines of space ops. Direct signal lines, operation lines of platforms, and E lines of factors. So the structure line division lines and A line rotation, center lines of 3 line centers, B lines of sequence, and C lines of center. Okay? Pi generation lines of A, 3 lines of 4, set lines of 5. 1, 2, 3, lines of position, lines of 4 over lines of 5 over sequence. A line tracks over line cross location lines and height centers of clocking lines of 1 and 2 and 3. Okay, crosses line over cross locates outline rotation, inside traction, indirect signals of ground lines of surface and travel. Setting lines of sequence, over lines calculation, modification, ground lines of setting. Okay, so planetary line centers is Saturn. Sets communication lines of ground lines of surface and tractions. Okay, operation signals, the 3 lines of A. Okay, so we get a 3 line here and a 3 line here and a 3 line of measure. Okay, sending course centers in travel and communications. Now, direct line your planetary line is a string theory lines of ground. So the center core system is a 3 lines of measure, 3 lines of scale. Set lines of 3 line centers, over line cross, location lines of 3 lines of measure, and communications. So we ground lines of symbolism, over cross lines of 1 signals over pi and travel. Okay? Direct lines, next X8000 comes in 3 lines of center, 3 travels, and communication lines of flux over screen. Calculate and modify lines of calculation setting. Clouds come in, over line signal location setting, metric meters, and scale communications. Directing lines of ground lines, course centers, and XT24000, ground lines of service, over cross location setting, and travel. Okay, this is a 500,000 clocking setting. A 500,000 clock right here. Okay, 500,000 clock in zeros and ones. Now, once you understand the metric core centers, it gets much easier to understand direct correlation setting, measure and scale how you can finger point your systems. Finger point lines of grounds. So we've got 4 lines settings, 3 lines of 1, 4 signatures lines of 3. See the 4 lines? Let's color the line core centers security lines because they automatically see you, and signature lines of patterns and radar and communication lines of thermal. 4 signature lines of grounds. So you calculate lines, cross over 2. All right, so we set a blue signal. I know it's complicated stuff, but it's a lot of fun, guys. Setting lines, I color it in blue because that's the lines, the position lines of plasma settings and travel. Okay, so my finger points are constantly in remote line screen. So I can change the frame core centers of travel and clocking line communications from 500,000 clocking into 0, 1 clocking setting back into 24 lines of sequence. So it's a balance of understanding location setting interactions. Now I have a direct line link change the clocking lines of zeros in 24 to 144 platform back in sequence. Now I'm going to overlines of scale. But I got to change the temperature reading lines of flux over screen because it moderates the system lines of constellation path, sets its course centers of Lyra, line connection setting to Orion's belt, setting communication lines. So setting lines of figure, course centers across line setting. Process indicates lines of space line bar, setting cross line signals over cross location of green lines of measure. Scales communication lines of balance communication setting to travel. 300,000 clocking setting. Right? 500,000 down to 3,000 clock. So it sets the rotary course centers of the solar system. There's the solar system interactions right there in set position. There's your solar system. There's your planetary line rotation cycles. I know it's complicated stuff, but it's a lot more fun when you really understand what's going on with your settings. Clocking your centers is string theory, guys. Modification lines and 150 feet line rotations. Clocking lines, the setting is location gridding. Remember the location setting when you come into your higher self? Sets communication lines of nominal acceleration lines, screen adaptations, lines of two panels, electrical line, grid communication lines of height lines of surface, process communication lines, electrical line, grid communication, operation line, position, travel. Sets calculation lines. You gotta start using your voice line grids, center operation setting, the complication awareness. Basically, you can copy and paste, set calculation lines, record the line sign for location lines of travel, puts the archive course centers lines of travel, has a reference timeline sequence line your voice. Get calculation lines. Now you're back in frequency lines of panel in communication confirmation system, all through partnership. Easy, done by equation. Sets tracks and set calculations. All through panels of operation. Okay? If I keep going, you're going to be mind blown more and more. But it's more fun when you just have fun. How you can finger point anything in Skyline grid. Right? So it's very important to understand what you're doing. Because your guys on Friday line sequence, you're going to be 2,444,000 lines of measure at scale. That's processed out calculations, zero lines, corresponding lines and road. That changes the lines in electrical line grids and communication lines of high tracker correlation system. All through your settings in your trackers, your energy grids, your power grids, correlation lines, set position of planetary service, your string theory in positioning your calculation screen lines into your gates and moderation system, all through travel. Very powerful and set position lines of communications. All right. But I just want you guys to understand your clocking systems of travel. Okay, your clocking systems of travel, guys. All right. So getting that position location, the 0-1 is the actual clocking setting where you start off provision and how you actually communicate to its traffic of its own inventory, of its own consciousness, of its own awareness, guys. It's very powerful when you come into that position. So you guys are finally coming into the clocking centers of 0 and 1. That's it. That's where you'll be on Friday. Setting lines of 0-1, 0-2. Yeah, position lines of 0-3. I don't need 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I just have 0, 1, 2, 3. Pi generation lines of 3 sectors, in lines of 1/3, 6 over 3, in 1/2 pipe and 1 center and 1 traction. Okay? So the balance out course centers is always in a 24 scale. Always 24. Always 24. That's your earth line rotation surface and traction. So that's your earth and center. Correlation lines of blue, plasma lines green, directing signal location lines of water, sequence lines of 7 body lines of screen adaptations and traction. Then you get a modification lines of grounds and forestry, calculation green lines, adaptation lines of flux over screen, and earth line rotation. Sending calculation line measure, scales communication lines of earth, line tone line, ground lines, communication lines of brown, and sequence lines of panel. Process calculation lines, direct signals, the ground lines of surface and traction, earth line rotation settings, all through traction. Hoo-ah! Powerful stuff, isn't it, guys? Now, your earth line rotates the cycles, has lines of travel and direct lines of modification grounds. It has communication height lines of measure and scale. Process lines of 1 over lines of sequence. Earth can rotate here into a half pipe inside tractions, inside measure and scale and rotations, all through pi and 3 lines of sectors. Complicated stuff, right? But this is 24 trillion clocking center. This is a 24 trillion clocking center in real time and remote. You understand how powerful that is? That's a 24 trillion clocking system. All right, so that's what I'm saying. I'm just trying to get you guys to understand how you can modify anything through clocking as long as you understand how to use it through zeros and ones. You got to clock your systems down, guys, to really understand the modification line position. So the Earth rotates the cycles, lines of generations, brown lines of sequence, over cross lines of 3 lines of angles. Molecular design line sets lines of course centers of 3 atoms, lines of set traction. Setting the right signals and modification high centers of space lines of modulation. Ground lines, course centers, line calculation lines of blue. Over cross location lines of green, and position location measure. Scales communication sending earth line to tone. Remote line signals, line screen adaptations back in sequence. Hooah. A 24 trillion clocking system. Oh yeah, all through setting. That's it, we're done. Woo! Ready to rock and roll? See you in 5.